This is Beyond the Big Screen podcast with your host, Steve Guerra, an Agora Podcast Network member.
I am very happy to be joined by Mark Vinet of the History of North America podcast, and we are going to talk about the incredible movie Apocalypto from 2006. This is really truly one of the greatest movies of all time, at least in my opinion. We are going to talk about the history and the real background behind this amazing movie. But before we get started, Mark, how are you doing today?
I'm wonderful, Steve, and I'm really pleased to be part of this.
Can you maybe tell us a little bit about yourself and a little bit about your podcast?
Well, I've always loved history ever since I was a young boy. And although I've greatly enjoyed traveling the world throughout my lifetime, North America remains my home and holds a special place in my mind, my heart, and my soul deep down. I've spent most of my life pursuing my passion for this part of the world as a historian, an author, professor, scholar, radio host, a lecturer, a videographer, a researcher, and a passionate tourist. I've traveled everywhere throughout the continent. And now, as a podcaster, I've chosen to present my podcast in a series of detailed episodes during which I attempt to inform, share, teach, and entertain my audience in a positive manner with the sweeping saga of the continent from its deep history origins to our present epoch. And for the purposes of my podcast, I define North America to include the USA, Canada, and Mexico. A lot of people define North America in different ways. You can include up to 30 countries, but I choose to explore the interesting and compelling and inspiring stories of these three great nations.
Yeah, I think that's awesome. That's really something I've always been interested in learning more about is how all three of the main countries, I guess you might say, of North America, how they fit together, because they really do fit together in ways that seemingly they don't fit together. And I think that's a really awesome project.
I strongly believe that the complete history of these three nations cannot be properly analyzed and understood without reference to the history of the other. Part of this saga also brings us to today's motion picture, which is set in the southernmost part of North America.
Yeah, so I will set this up just a little bit before we dig into kind of the nitty gritty of this movie, but just kind of a 10,000-foot view. Apocalypto is a movie set in approximately 1500 CE, Mesoamerica. The film was directed, written, produced, and all of the above by Mel Gibson. The movie was released right after Gibson had a famous drunk driving incident where he had an anti-Semitic rant, and that kind of cast a shadow over the movie. But so just to put that into a little bit of context as we go into the conversation, the movie was completely filmed using a Mesoamerican native language, commonly called Maya, which again we'll get in, or Mayan, which we'll get into a little bit more detail about that because that's a really interesting facet of the movie. The cast featured entirely Native American and or Mexican actors, including Rudy Youngblood, Dalia Hernandez, Raul Trujillo, and many more. A lot of these actors would be more well known in Mexican film, oftentimes, than they would be in more of a US based film market. I think that this movie, to me, just to set the stage where I've come from with the movie, it really captures humanity in all of its best and its worst. I really feel like this movie was a masterpiece in storytelling. And as usual, we won't go through the movie scene by scene, and I highly suggest you watch this movie, listen to the episode, then watch the movie again. And I was when I rewatched this movie in the last week, I think I've probably seen the movie a dozen times, and I get more out of it each time. So that's why I'm really glad, Mark, that you were able to come on and discuss this movie. So I know I'll watch it again. But so, Mark, why don't you set us up a little bit about some of the background and the history of Mesoamerica and the Maya?
The plot of this movie, Steve, isn't particularly original. It's a fast-paced chase movie in the end. Very few films are set in Mesoamerica, which is a historical region and cultural area that includes central and southern Mexico. It's an area that I examine in episodes 8, 9, and 11 of my own podcast. And within this region, I take a close look at the pre-Columbian enlightened societies. Now, pre-Columbian, of course, meaning what happened in North America before Christopher Columbus sailed in 1492. Now, the enlightened societies in this region flourished for thousands of years before the Spanish colonization of the region. Mesoamerica was the site of one of the most profound historical transformations in history, at the same level as Mesopotamia in the Middle East. Mesoamerica is one of the 5 areas in the world where ancient civilization arose independently, and one of only 3 regions where writing is known to have developed on its own. When you think of that, it's just mind-boggling that so much was happening in such a small, restrained area. That particular area is defined by its cultural traits, its religious traditions, and we see a lot of this in the movie. There were 3 major civilizations that arose in Mesoamerica before Columbus arrived. And the first major civilization was called the Olmecs civilization, Olmecs. And they began to occupy the area around 1500 BCE up to about 400 BCE. They laid many of the foundations for the great civilizations that followed. And at this point, it's key to understand the timeline. So all you listeners who are chronologically challenged folks, and I know a lot of smart people who are challenged in this way, the Mayan civilization began around 500 BCE and came before the Aztec Empire. So many people I speak to get the two mixed up, or they think that both of them flourished in a parallel fashion. But actually, it was the Mayan civilization that developed first in the BCE years. They reached their most advanced point around 450 CE and then began their decline, rapid decline as a matter of fact, in about 900 CE. And it's after them that the Aztec took over and basically conquered the area during the 1400s right up until the Spanish arrived and conquered them. Now, a lot of what we see in the movie, to me, is a mixture of Mayan and Aztec civilization. Because the movie takes place, I think at the beginning of the film, Steve, they mention the year 1502. At that point, Mayan civilization was on the decline big time. Most of their huge mega cities had been abandoned around the year 900. And although their civilization continued, especially in the Yucatan Peninsula, where the movie takes place, they were really on the skids. It was the Aztecs who were in control and who were extremely powerful and had these wonderful, large, huge cities that were their power base. Now, Mel Gibson made, I think, an artistic choice to focus on one civilization, the Mayan, and he gave them much more power and importance, I think, in the movie at the time that it was set in 1500 than he perhaps should have, because it was really the Aztec that were controlling that whole area. So he Hollywoodized the history a bit, but to great effect, because, as you know, if a film just goes left and right in different directions, then the audience often has difficulty following. But when Mayan civilization began encountering difficulties in the 9th century, we still don't have an accepted theory that explains their collapse. But a lot of the reasons that have been proposed, we see in the movie. There's rebellion, there's civil war, there's overpopulation resulting in severe environmental degradation, and there's drought. All these things are hinted at in the movie with respect to what happened to the Maya hundreds of years before that was also happening to the Aztec at this point in time.
It's a big movie, and I think maybe a good place to start is that they kind of set up a juxtaposition between the village where the main character lives and the big city. And it's kind of a hero journey of the main character going from a village life that's really very hunter-gatherer and then they show this complicated and complex city. Was that kind of how the society was organized back then? Were there bands of hunter gatherers living parallel to extremely sophisticated city dwellers?
Yes, there were, especially during the Aztec years. The main city, the capital city, Tenochtitlan, it was built and structured in a way that it was not controlling its territory by force, but more by allowing the cities to run themselves, to be in control of their own internal affairs, but by giving tribute a few times a year to the capital city. So as long as they got their tribute, that's what was important to the Aztec. The Mayans had more of a hands-on approach, and that included not only the villages, but also other city-states. So yes, that is a realistic way of presenting how the civilization was structured. You had enormous, highly developed and advanced and sophisticated civilizations and prosperous cities alongside smaller villages.
From what I've read, even over the course of, my years of adulthood, just picking up on articles here and there along the way of Mesoamerican archaeology, it seems to have drastically changed over the years, and things that they thought for sure a couple of years ago get completely blown out of the water with new evidence. What was the general character, I guess, of what we know, at least as of today in late 2020, early 2021? What do we know about the sophistication level of their cities and maybe a little bit of how they were organized?
Maya cities were located in places that controlled trade routes and that could supply essential products. And they tended to be dispersed and were subject to irregular expansion with the haphazard growth outwards from the core. So that's how their cities would be built. The city centers were occupied by ceremonial and administrative complexes and surrounded by an irregular sprawl of residential districts. Around these cities, they would tap into the natural resources. And we see this in the movie. At one point, we realize that the forests around the large city are being depleted. We also see them mining for limestone, which they use in various manners and various ways in the city. And to create 1 ton of limestone, you had to cut down 5 tons of trees. So we see them depleting their resources. That's one thing that we've known for a while, but that has been re-emphasized by more recent discoveries. With regards to the political rule, well, that was centered on the concept of the divine king, who acted as a mediator between mortals and the supernatural realm. And this kingship was patrilineal, and the power would normally pass to the eldest son. Now, a prospective king was also expected to be a successful military leader for the Mayan world that was dominated by warring superpowers. So there was a lot more internal wars and civil wars going on during this era than most people thought, perhaps a generation or two ago. It was often believed that the Maya were the more peaceful of the civilizations from Mesoamerica, and the Aztecs were more violent. But with time, we've realized that the Mayans also practiced blood sacrifice on a human and an animal level that was extremely high, and it was widespread throughout all of the Mesoamerican cultures and a theme in the Mayan religion.
It's interesting you bring up the human sacrifice element, and maybe we'll kind of inch towards there because there's a couple of things in the movie that I think are worth delving in a little bit deeper that get us eventually to the human sacrifice. In the beginning of the movie, the whole stage is set when the kind of the bucolic ideal village, hunter-gatherer village, is attacked by a band of warriors, and we see pretty quickly that they're there 100% to catch the people. They're not there to destroy the village and maybe take their stuff. This war band is there to capture the people. And initially, when I first saw the movie, I'm thinking, well, they're there to take them as slaves, and that's not necessarily what all of them are being taken for. But maybe we could first talk about slavery and how what maybe in the Mesoamerican culture, how did they view slavery? Was it in a similar context as maybe we see it in the European or Western mindset, or was it a different version of slavery? Not that any version's good, but different, you might say.
Well, as we know, slavery has been part of human societies for thousands of years. And in Mesoamerica, slavery developed for all the common reasons that helped develop the practice everywhere else. Basically, for an exercise of power, control, and for free labor. Mesoamerican civilizations and the cities that were built were often built on the back of slave labor. Now, slaves were also employed in the practice of human sacrifice, which was to win favors from their many gods. Sacrifice was a religious activity, as we said, in Maya culture, and involved the killing of both humans and animals. And bloodletting or auto-sacrifice by the members of the community was prevalent and superintended by priests. Human sacrifice was very complex. It was a brutal ritual which was performed in honor of the gods. Every sacrifice had to be meticulously planned, from the type of victim to the specific ceremony needed for the god. The sacrificial victims were usually captured warriors, like in our movie, but sometimes slaves. I don't think in Apocalypto, our heroes who were captured were not captured to be slaves. As we find out, they were captured to be sacrificed. Now, the women were sold into slavery, and we see that in the movie. And the older folks, one in particular, is just abandoned and not even sold because there's no buyers. But with respect to the men, they're seen as warriors, and they are seen as high-level sacrifice victims depending upon the god and the needed ritual. Now, the higher the rank of the warrior, the better he was considered as a sacrifice. The victims would then take on a persona of the god they were to be sacrificed for, and they were often housed, fed, and dressed accordingly. This process could last up to a year, and that's not the case in the film, of course. It is a 2-hour movie, and things have to move ahead, and everything is very concentrated within a few days. So they're captured, they're marched to the capital city, then offered for sacrifice. But in reality, a lot of these sacrificial victims were prepared 1 year in advance, and when the sacrificial day finally arrived, the victims would participate in the specific ceremonies of the deity and were sometimes drugged in order to exhaust the victims so that they could not struggle during the horrifying ceremony. Then the priest performed the sacrifice, usually at the top of the pyramid, and each victim would be laid upon a table, held down, and subsequently have their hearts cut out. In my opinion, Apocalypto portrayed a type of human sacrifice which was more typical of the Aztecs than of the Maya. That's where I think both cultures were fused for Hollywood purposes.
That's something that I've been thinking about, is, and especially since you've brought it up, is that the movie focuses in on these people who are Maya, but you're saying by about the year 1500, they had been kind of on the down and outs for a good 500 years. And it was really the Aztecs, and they're displaying more of the Aztec culture. What were kind of the big differences that we could wrap our minds around between Aztec culture in the 1500s and maybe peak Mayan culture?
Firstly, the Mayan culture and civilization lasted for about 1,000 years. And that's why we refer to it as historians as the Mayan civilization or the Mayan culture. The Aztecs was much more concentrated and didn't last as long, and we refer to them usually as an empire, the Aztec Empire, which was an alliance of 3 city-states that ruled the area in and around the Valley of Mexico from 1428 until 1521, when they were defeated by the Spanish. Now, many folks think that it was just a few hundred Spanish soldiers with modern weapons who conquered the great and mighty Aztec Empire. In actual truth, it was the Spanish conquistadors who allied themselves with the many, many Aztec enemies who were native of the area and decided to all join together and defeat the empire. And that's what actually happened. But the Aztec were very controlling, and they were often viewed throughout history as more brutal or more brutes than the Mayans. And I think that's one of the reasons why Mel Gibson preferred telling the story of the Mayas instead of the Aztec. I think he saw the Mayans as being a bit more sophisticated in their culture than the Aztecs. For example, the Aztec military leader, Tlaloc, who was the leader of the capital that I mentioned, Tenochtitlan, he was the principal architect of the Aztec Triple Alliance and hence the Aztec Empire. He also instigated a policy of burning the books of conquered Mesoamerican peoples with the aim of erasing all memories of pre-Aztec past. So that's just a hint at how the Aztecs did not necessarily respect the histories and pasts and cultures of their tributary city-states.
So that was actually an Aztec who planned the book burning?
Yes, it's not discussed very much in history.
No.
What's usually discussed is the Spanish the Spanish priests and clergy who eventually burned Mesoamerican books. But ironically, before the Spanish arrived, Aztec leaders were burning books themselves. So we can see clearly that burning of books is a kind of universal when it comes to wanting to erase the history of conquered peoples.
And now, a brief word from our sponsors. I think that that's really, and that adds another layer to the fact that of the conquest of Mexico by the Spanish in particular is the fact that they played alliances against the Aztecs of native alliances, and that it wasn't just Cortez comes in, it's like 25 guys, they take out a civilization of millions of a highly technical civilization who, I mean, they didn't have metallurgy, but they had a really effective weaponry and they were far, far numerically superior. It really, the standard telling that you might get in your elementary or even your high school education of the conquest of Mexico, really it takes away the agency of the Mesoamericans and the Aztecs.
With respect to Mesoamericans, they were weakened by civil wars and by internal conflicts between the different cultures, the different nations, the different city-states. And it's what we think is one of the main reasons why they were defeated so handily and so easily by the Spanish. That and many other reasons, environmental depletion, but internal strife amongst Amerindians is one of the key factors.
A really interesting, just to shift gears a little bit, an interesting part of the filmmaking is that Mel Gibson decided to film this movie entirely in the native language of the Mayans. He had done that before in The Passion of the Christ, which I believe was it came out maybe about 2 years before this movie. So he had sampled with using completely native languages in his movies. What can we say and what do we know about the language that he decided to use for these people?
All of the ethnic tribes and peoples depicted in the film were Maya, as well as the city built for the story. And similar to Gibson's earlier film, as you mentioned, The Passion of the Christ, in which he used the Aramaic language, which is the actual language that Jesus of Nazareth spoke, all the dialogue in Apocalypto is a modern approximation of the ancient language of the setting. And here, the indigenous Yucatec Maya language is spoken, with subtitles, of course. Now, Gibson initially didn't even want to put subtitles, and he thought that would have an effect. But he was convinced by the powers that be, I assume, in the large studios, that subtitles were needed. And this is what he actually said when it came to the use of the language. He said, "I think hearing a different language allows the audience to completely suspend their own reality and get drawn into the world of the film. And more importantly, this also puts the emphasis on the cinematic visuals, which are a kind of universal language of the heart." With regards to subtitles, I'd like to ask you your opinion. How do you deal with subtitles when watching a movie?
It's so funny, and when I was just thinking of that with the subtitles, you almost with this movie, like when I was watching it last, somebody was talking in the background at my house, and I had to turn up the sound, even though I don't speak Yucatec. I think that the language of the movie, and choosing to use the language was so critical to the movie. I think the movie would have been honestly probably not nearly as good if they were speaking English. And I think the subtitles, you could almost lose yourself in the subtitles, and you could still follow the movie and just, not be studying the subtitles, but just glancing at them and kind of focusing back and forth. But the language is really what carries it through, I think.
Well, I agree in both his movies, The Passion of the Christ and also this one. I'm a big fan of subtitles. And even when I'm watching an American TV series, I'll have the subtitles on because I love words. I love reading, I love writing, and I just love how words are crafted. So when I'm listening to TV from any time during the day, I'll have the subtitles on because firstly, I don't like missing anything. I like catching all the words and the dialogue. Also, I love to see how names are spelled. And let's face it, a lot of actors are mumbling and the sound isn't always 100%. So I really like to see what's going on. And it's a skill that I think I've acquired over time. I can read subtitles so quickly, and my eyes can flip from the titles to the screen, and I can see everything that's happening. So when I have a TV program or a film without subtitles, I feel a bit denied or a bit lost. So I really like subtitles. So I have no problem with the fact that he used them in both movies. I know a lot of people are allergic to subtitles and it might even turn them off from watching a film, but I feel otherwise.
That's so interesting. My daughter, and I've never met anybody else who's done that. It's probably since she's been a little girl. She's always put on the subtitles or the closed captioning on everything she would watches on TV.
It's a habit that you can acquire. My kids, since they were little, have always watched TV with subtitles. And when the subtitles aren't on, they're the first to ask, "Hey, what's going on? We want to see the written words."
Oh,
So,
that's really interesting.
yeah. We were talking about Mel Gibson and how he viewed the subtitles. I just wanted to add his opinion regarding the actual genre of the film, because as I mentioned earlier, it's a typical action adventure chase movie, but he said that he wanted to shake it up a bit. He did not want to use and have his movie be dominated by CGI and stock stories and shallow characters to create a foot chase that would, in his own words, feel like a car chase that just keeps turning the screws. He was successful in the way he put together this film from an action point of view. When watching the film, we realize at one point the whole film shifts into the chase genre. And that's when, of course, there is the eclipse, the sacrificial intended victims are saved, and then are put through this game, which is basically an instigation for chase. So I think he actually makes it work brilliantly.
Yeah, he really does. One thing maybe we'll back up at this one particular element connects the beginning and the end of the film. The main character puts his pregnant wife and his toddler son into this deep pit. And I was wondering, I know that in central Mexico and in the Yucatan Peninsula, they do have these like pits. And from your research and from what you maybe know about the movie, was that a man made object for water collection, or was that a natural geological feature, rather?
I think the one in the movie was a natural pit cave that also served as a water reservoir. Some communities, some villages who built their own pit caves, but I think this was a natural one. It was depleted of water, and that's why it was used as a hiding place by the hero's wife and child. Now, we learn later on in the movie that the whole area is experiencing a severe drought, thus understand why the pit cave is empty. And when it begins to rain later on in the movie, we then understand why the hero reacts in a panicked fashion because he knows what's going to happen.
And there's so much great foreshadowing in the movie. It's well worth mentioning that it has a lot of tropes that are built into chase movies. Like there's a jump off of a waterfall, there's fire arrows, there's all sorts of great things. And I think that that's what's great. This is just a great movie, and then you layer on this incredible setting of a historical era and a historical people that at least in English language movies, we're not accustomed to seeing. I thought that that was really a great thing that Mel Gibson, that's what probably elevates this to a great movie.
Oh, definitely. Well, allow me to tell the folks a little bit about Mel Gibson, who was born in New York State, but at the age of 12, his family moved to Australia where his paternal grandmother was born. Now, for many years back in the 80s and 90s, I thought that Mel Gibson was Australian, like most folks. He has that accent, and his first movies were made out of Australia, but actually, he's an American. He was born in the Northeast. In Australia, as a young man, he began acting and soon became one of the world's most popular leading men for 2 decades. And in the midst of this immensely successful career as a versatile actor, he turned his varied talents to directing and, in my opinion, morphed into a serious, visionary master filmmaker. It's remarkable how Gibson can film scenes of heartfelt emotion with sweet subtlety as easily as he stages some of the most vicious visual scenes of violence that you will ever see. Now, I'm not a big fan of violence on the screen, blood, guts, and gore. I can sometimes do without the extent in which he goes to, but he really knows how to lay it on and for it to be effective. Now, in Apocalypto, Gibson shows his staggering gifts as a filmmaker, and he's able to put forth a dichotomy of the Mayan society, which was beauty and brutality, sophistication and savagery, the negative, the positive, the good, the bad, the pretty, the ugly. He goes everywhere, shows the culture, but also the cruelty. So I really feel that he encompasses all of what that society was in a 2-hour movie and does it very, very well.
And now, a brief word from our sponsors. Yeah, absolutely. I think two pieces that are worth mentioning and worth discussing was there's some scenes where show people who are clearly infected with some sort of like smallpox or something to that extent, and then the famine. And I'm wondering if that was there was clearly crop failures and some sort of weather. Like you said, they were definitely experiencing a drought because everywhere that they showed were failed crops and failed agriculture. And I'm wondering if at about that time when the Spanish did reach Mexico, did the disease kind of move ahead of them? When they landed, were people already being infected with these Eurasian diseases like smallpox, etc.?
That's a bizarre part of the movie because they tell us that it started in 1502, and history tells us that Europeans' first contact with Mayans was probably in 1502 during Columbus's fourth journey, but not really in that area. And the contact with the Mayans happened only a bit later. I think Gibson takes the encounter with Mayans during the year 1511 and kind of morphs or merges it into the setting of the movie and the time frame of 1502 and has all that happening at the same time. But you don't know what the little girl is suffering from, the girl who appears in the movie and is inflicted by the plague. The disease that the Europeans brought, which ravaged the indigenous inhabitants of the entire Yucatan Peninsula, causing a population decline which varied from 75 to 90%. That disease was smallpox, and she seemed to be suffering of that. But had the contact actually been made? So that's a little confusing there. But we know that the disease was one of the reasons why the whole area was decimated due to the unwitting transmission of it by the Europeans. And we also know that if we take a mature, once again, view of history, that both societies, upon contact, exchanged viruses and diseases. It's just that, unfortunately for Amerindians, they got the shorter end of the stick and they were more affected by European diseases than the Europeans were from any viruses that the natives were transmitting.
One thing that is interesting is the agriculture of the indigenous Amerindians of Mesoamerica. What kind of agriculture were they using at that point? They kind of show like corn stalks, but I think they wanted to draw our attention to that a bit. But what kind of agriculture would have been common amongst those particular people in that particular place?
Well, as with so many things in their society, they were very sophisticated and they had developed advanced farming techniques. And their three staple crops were what they called the three sisters: corn, squash, and beans. They really knew how to efficiently grow these crops in order to feed their large cities. However, one thing they couldn't do was grow those crops without rain. And that's why the droughts were so devastating. That's what seems to be happening at the time of this movie. The drought is causing great pain and suffering to the Mayans, and that's why they're going through this period of human sacrifice in order to try and appease the gods. Now, another thing they were sophisticated about was astronomy, and they knew when astronomical events occurred, including eclipses of the sun. Now, when they're about to sacrifice our heroes as sacrificial victims, a solar eclipse occurs and the executioner pauses. The Mayans take the event as an omen that the gods are satisfied with the blood spilt so far, and that's the reason why Jaguar Paw, who is the name of our hero, and the remaining captives are spared from sacrifice. But this was, at a certain level, trickery by the powerful and the folks who were in charge of the society, the leaders, who had the knowledge to know that there would be a solar eclipse at a certain time and a certain day, and a big show was put on. And the movie takes place during one of these big shows when, in order to enhance the power of the king and his court and all the priests, they are executing prisoners and warriors until the solar eclipse arrives, which gives them the power that they are communicating directly with the gods.
Well, yeah, that was definitely a powerful part of the movie, and I didn't realize that really changes it. Even having seen the movie that much, I kind of thought that maybe it was for show and that they knew that eclipse was coming, but I didn't know the extent of how well they could predict that sort of solar event.
If you don't know that fact about the Mayans, then what happens in the movie seems a bit hard to believe as a coincidence and seems to be one of those Hollywood contrivances. But actually, the way I interpret it is that the Mayan scientists, and we can use that word, they knew it was coming, and that whole event was planned around it.
Mel Gibson is an absolutely prolific filmmaker, and there's just so many movies he made. Maybe you could tell us some of these movies because I'm sure a lot of people have watched many of them, but just to give people kind of a scope of what a magnificent filmmaker he is.
In addition to Apocalypto, Gibson directed 1993's The Man Without a Face, 1995's Braveheart, for which he won an Oscar for Best Director, 2004's The Passion of the Christ, and 2016's Hacksaw Ridge. And you can tell from his directorial choices that he favors historical dramas. He also acted in a Revolutionary War film, Patriot, which your series covered at one point, and I enjoyed that episode. But like all non-documentary films, his movies are what one can describe, as I mentioned, as Hollywoodized history. But he does it in such an effective way. I saw Hacksaw Ridge recently, and he strays a lot from the actual events that occurred at Hacksaw Ridge during the Pacific War and World War II. But the way he brings it all together, because we have to remember, films, and I know you've repeated this often throughout your series, films are not history, they're not documentaries, they're art, their culture, their entertainment. And I think he's a master at what he does. I like it when he delves into the historical zone because I think that's where he's at his best, and I hope that he continues.
Yeah, his acting is unbelievable too. He j great roles like in Payback, the probably what you might be the new Christmas classic, Fat Man, where he plays Santa Claus, an anti-hero Santa Claus, which just came out. Just a incredible body of work, and I hope that, personally, he's kind of overcome maybe some of his demons that brought him to I mean, alcohol and drugs and that sort of thing can definitely bring out the worst in people, and maybe he does have a healthy dose of the, tortured artist in him.
He's a very intense human being. We can see that in his interviews. One Hollywood reviewer recently said, and I thought that was so apropos, he said, Mel Gibson's a lunatic, but he's our lunatic.
Yeah, absolutely. I think as a great way to wrap up today, I always am interested in hearing what people think and what their idea would if Hollywood knocked on your door and said, Mark, pick a interesting time in history for a historical drama movie setting. What would be your choice?
I'd pick Mel Gibson to do a movie about the American Civil War. I'd like to see how he would treat that in this modern age, and I would really like to give him free reins, a huge budget to do just that. And I hope he stays in the realm of history. Even if he avoids the Civil War and goes elsewhere, I'll be following.
Yeah, that would definitely be a great one. Well, Mark, thank you so much for coming on today. I've learned more about this wonderful movie that, like I said, I've seen it many, many times, and I'll definitely go and watch it again, based on this conversation that we had, because I think I'll be able to look at it again through a completely different lens. If people want to, and they certainly should, go listen to your great podcast, where can they find more information on how to subscribe?
Everything about my projects and activities can be found at markvinet.com. That's Mark with a K, because where I'm from, some folks spell Mark with a C, but in my case, it is the letter K. So it's markvinet.com. And there you will find info regarding my History of North America podcast and videocast series, along with details regarding the nonfiction and fiction books I have authored, including international historical mystery and suspense thrillers. Each novel revolves around a missing historical object that the hero and heroine must locate and retrieve. All my books are available in print and digital format on Amazon. Some have described my novels as Da Vinci Code meets Mission Impossible, so they're thrillers, and I hope folks check them out.
Well, that's really great. I very much appreciate you coming on to the show, and I have a feeling, and I definitely hope that the people can hear more collaborations between us on the History of the Papacy podcast, because I think there's a lot of area of overlap that we can talk about there too.
Thank you, Steve, for granting me the great honor and privilege of sharing your wonderful audience. It's been a real pleasure, and I hope we can get to do it again soon.
Thank you again for listening to the Beyond the Big Screen podcast. Of course, a huge thanks goes out to our good friend, Mark Vinet of the History of North America podcast. Links to learn more about Mark's great podcast can be found at his website, markvinet.com, or in the show notes. A great way to support Beyond the Big Screen is to leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. These ratings and reviews really help me learn what you are thinking about the podcast and help other people learn about the podcast as well. You can follow us on social media on Twitter and Facebook by searching for A2Z History. You can also learn about other ways to support the show and much, much more at our website, a2zhistorypage.com. The website's always a little bit of a work in progress, but I really appreciate your support, and I will see you next time beyond the big screen.